When Russia launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the odds were not equal. Russia spent 10 times more on its military than Ukraine and had an overwhelming superiority in military equipment. The Ukrainian military could not resist it for long. Ukraine's only hope was to receive help from its allies, but Ukraine needed to survive long enough on its own for the help to arrive. This video will cover how Ukraine was able to hold on. But before we proceed, a message from our sponsor. Let's say that you are going on a secret mission. Before you go, you need to get some intel online. You need to keep your location secret, so you use this video sponsor Atlas VPN. The information from your devices goes through Atlas VPN server, and from there it'll be encrypted according to your preferences, so your location is hidden. You cannot access the page you need because the traffic from your country has been blocked, but you overcome it with Atlas VPN by changing your country of origin. Despite proxy connections, Atlas VPN provides fast internet speeds and you can see the video in full detail. You start taking notes, but then you are attacked by your eternal nemesis on the internet: ads. Luckily with Atlas VPN you can quickly block them, but then the opponent's cyber attack cuts the power. Well, you can use an Atlas VPN account with all of your devices and you just switch to your phone. With the intel received, you now need to travel to another country, but the agency is short on money for good accommodation. By routing your connection through other countries via Atlas VPN, you can get a good deal on accommodation and you are off on the secret mission. But you ask yourself, can the agency afford the VPN service? Well, yes it can. And so can you, because Atlas VPN is the most affordable VPN service. Right now it is running a huge discount. It means you can get a 3-year subscription for just $183 plus 3 months free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so get your deal by clicking the link in the video description below. Now let's get back to the winter of 2022. Ukraine relied on the help from its allies, but in order to receive it, Ukraine had to hold on. Russia could use its superiority in equipment to quickly encircle and destroy the weaker Ukrainian army by using blitzkrieg tactics. Ukraine hoped to counter this with appropriate tactics. One tactic was to fortify its troops in the cities. This would force the Russians to fight in urban terrain, which is very costly for the attacker. The second tactic was to strongly defend a suitable part of terrain. These defensive advantages would be enough to nullify the Russian superiority in equipment and allow the Ukrainian forces to hold on. Ukraine hoped that these tactics would allow its forces to survive the Russian invasion long enough for its allies to send help. We still don't know many things for sure about the war, and the following is my opinion on how the events unfolded. The invasion was launched from 3 directions. The decisive offensive of the first period of war took place in the north, and we will look at it first. The Ukrainian troops had fortified themselves in the larger towns, while the Russian invasion forces were stationed in Belarus and Russia. The Russian plan was for the special forces to land near Kyiv and topple Ukraine's government, which was expected to shatter the Ukrainian resistance. The ground forces were to use that and occupy the major cities in the region. But the special forces' assault failed. The ground forces moved in, but they were too weak to conquer northeast Ukraine on their own. In the north, the Russians occupied the small undefended cities but failed to capture Chernihiv. On the southern part of the region, the Russians got quickly stuck before Ukrainian defenses in Sumy and other smaller towns. In the center, the Russians secured the city of Konotop under their control and continued forward. They bypassed the town of Nizhin and reached Kyiv's suburb of Brovara. But the Russians had dispersed their forces near the Ukrainian cities, and the troops that had reached Kyiv were too weak to launch a proper assault on the city. They had to halt their offensive. At the same time, the second Russian attack came from Belarusian territory north of Kyiv. Without large cities to hold them back, the Russian forces quickly reached the Ukrainian capital. They now began to storm the city. Part of the forces moved south to cut off the supply route into Kyiv, and the others battled towards the center of the city through its suburbs, Bucha and Irpin. But then the tide began to turn. The Russians had not destroyed the Ukrainian army, and it now began to attack Russian supply lines. In addition, Russia had only some tens of thousands of troops near Kyiv, while the city's population was just under 3 million. Having armed part of the city's population, the Ukrainian forces gained the upper hand and started pushing the Russians back. The Russian command realized that the Russian forces in the area were too weak to take Kyiv and lacked forces to even properly maintain their supply lines. The order was given to abandon the campaign and withdraw their forces completely from northern Ukraine. In the beginning of April, the Russian forces had pulled out from northern Ukraine to fight another day. At the same time, there was fighting in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. In eastern Ukraine, there was the industrial region of Donbas. This region offered much better opportunities for defense, and Ukraine decided to dig in here. After the fighting in 2014 and 2015, the region was split between Ukrainian-controlled territory and lands controlled by the pro-Russian separatists. Ukraine had built strong fortifications on the line of contact and now made them into a part of the defensive line. In the north, the Ukrainian defenses were set up behind the Siversky Donets River. The defensive line was strengthened by the existence of several cities, with the cities of Kharkiv and Mariupol serving as the corner points. When the invasion commenced, the Russian forces occupied the undefended area north of the Ukrainian defensive line. At the same time, they launched an attack against the Ukrainian defenses in the south. This attack was meant to support the Russian advance from the south, where Russia invaded Ukraine from the Crimea. The Ukrainians did not apply their special tactics there. Their forces were deployed near the border and were strongly disorganized during the initial Russian assault, which allowed the Russians to advance without encountering much resistance. In the east, the Russians' goal was to reach the Donbas. After defeating the Ukrainians at the border, they quickly took Melitopol. The Ukrainians were only able to regroup near Orikhiv and Hulyai-Pola, where they stopped the Russian advance. It allowed the Russians to freely advance in the south, where they took Berdyansk and approached Mariupol. This is when the attack against the Ukrainian Donbas defenses comes into play. It was a strong attack and broke through the Ukrainian field fortifications. With their positions outflanked, the Ukrainian forces took in the defense in the city of Mariupol. The Russians began capturing the city in urban warfare. They had to spend 2.5 months in heavy battles for the city until they managed to take it. At the same time, the Russian forces were advancing from Crimea to the west with the presumable goal of reaching Odessa. In the beginning of the invasion, the Ukrainian forces were shattered by the Russians and had to abandon the Dnieper River line and the city of Kherson to the Russians. But then the Ukrainian forces regrouped in the cities on the southern Bug River. The Russians attempted to take Mykolaiv and cross the river, but they could not take it. They then moved to capture the breach at Voznesensk, but they could not take that city either. The Russians abandoned their plans of crossing the southern Bug and pulled back to more defensible positions. They then consolidated their defensive positions on the southern part of the front. During February and March, the Russians had stretched their forces out along the whole front. They had made inroads into Ukrainian territory, but failed to encircle and destroy much of the Ukrainian army, which allowed Ukraine to continue the resistance. Now they deployed them in one place. They pulled out their troops from northern Ukraine and stopped the advance in the south. They concentrated only on the Ukrainian-held part of the Donbas, with the goal of encircling the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians hoped that their defenses on the Siversky Donets River and their field fortifications would be strong enough to prevent Russians from breaking through. In the south, the Ukrainian fortifications were weaker, but for reasons that are not fully clear, Russia did not choose to launch major attacks there. In order to cut off the Ukrainian forces, Russia needed to cover 160 kilometers. The main attack would be launched from the north. The town of Izium was just in the way of the Russian forces. The Russians assaulted it, but the Ukrainians were able to hold on for the whole month of March. The time the Russians had spent on taking Izium gave the Ukrainians the time to understand the Russian plan and prepare a strong defense. The Russians ran into heavy resistance and during the month of April could only cover very little ground. The Russians realized that they had little chance of breaking through. They adopted an easier goal, with their objective being to cut off the Ukrainian-held cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. The distance to cover was 50 kilometers. The fighting took place mostly in late April and May. The Russians approached the Siversky Donets from the north, but then they realized that crossing the river was too risky. The Russians switched their main effort to the southern attack. Here they gained some ground, but the Ukrainian defenses held on until they could bring strong reinforcements. This meant that cutting off the Ukrainian forces would prove too difficult. The Russians then decided for an even simpler goal. They decided to approach the two cities from the south and encircle them that way. During the month of June, they took this territory and Ukraine had to pull its forces out to avoid encirclement and Russia gained control over the cities. What happened next? Well, the front line did not move much for some weeks, and then this video was uploaded to YouTube. By holding out, Ukraine has been able to receive help from its allies, which has made the Ukrainian defense more successful. During the first month, Ukraine received a lot of anti-tank weapons, which has lessened the advantage of Russian tank forces. The allies have also replenished Ukraine's stocks of artillery ammunition, which has allowed it to continue the struggle. The arrival of American anti-ship missiles has lessened the role of the Russian fleet, and the long-range artillery has helped Ukraine in general by limiting Russian supply flow. But the outcome of the struggle is not certain, as Russia still retains the advantage in several ways. Ukraine has done everything it can do on its part by holding out, but the rest is dependent on its allies and how much help they are willing and able to give. Support anonymity on the internet by trying out Atlas VPN. Get a time-limited deal of just $183 a month for 3 years with 3 months free by using the link in the description.